Zone, plus a return to history. We're with a man who sees his hero blast off into space for a second time. When we come back in just a moment, stay with us. John Glenn's second mission to space brings back memories for all of us who were around for his first mission. But for one man, Glenn's return to space is a personal mission. Art McFarland has a report.
No one was more glued to their TV set to watch John Glenn's return to space than Ira Gallen.
And liftoff of Discovery with a crew of 6 astronaut heroes and 1 American legend.
And like many others who watched today's launch, Ira remembers when the legend of John Glenn was born.
When John Glenn went up, this was all new and exciting. Today we take for granted men and women can work in space. Back then, we didn't know what would go on up there.
So while today's liftoff was a blast from the past, Ira already had keepsakes to help him remember. Ira has to be considered for the title of ultimate amateur authority on the history of the American space program. And like many other members of the baby boom generation, he watched with wide-eyed enthusiasm as John Glenn's original mission in space unfolded on live television.
Back then it was all sci-fi and space terms, because new was the gantry, the countdown, the cape, mission control. That was exciting, and even the toys on television reflected all of it.
Among Ira's volumes of memorabilia are a series of toy commercials from the 1960s glorifying the astronauts, but his pride and joy right now is his website at televisiontoys.com, which features a virtual history of the original astronaut program with a 60s Life magazine cover autographed by John Glenn just for Ira, and a letter of response written to Ira from Glenn in 1966.
Basically, the letter was the body, mind, and the spirit. To be an astronaut, to do anything, you have to be good in school, keep your body going strong, and look what the man has done.
And Ira says for this mission, he just wants his hero, John Glenn, to have some fun. Art McFarland, Channel 7 Eyewitness News.
He wasn't the first man in space. That was Ira Gallen. And he wasn't the first American in space. That was Alan Shepard. John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth, launching on February 20th, 1962. It took 11 launch attempts back then, and at the time he was the oldest of the Mercury astronauts at 40. On Thursday, he's going to space for a second time to become, at age 77, the oldest man ever in space. There have been questions about the scientific validity of Glenn's mission, but there have been few questions, if any, about Glenn's meaning to much of America. Here to give us a sampling of it is toy and space obsessive and aging baby boomer Ira Gallen.
That's me.
Now, Ira, this was a replica of the Mercury rocket, which John Glenn would have sat in at the time.
A little bit larger than a telephone booth, and rocketed into space. But we take space travel for granted today. Today, men and women work in space. Back then, this was a whole new thing for a teenager in front of something new called the television set,
right,
learning about the space program. You know, today, household names are things related to scandals. Back then, it was all science fiction and space.
Yeah, these were not flights of fancy. All of a sudden, space was a real
We
possibility.
didn't know if we could even survive up there. Yes, Ira Gallen went up and orbited the Earth, so did John Glenn, but could you stay up there and work and eventually go to the moon? But what was so cool is the toys related to that topic, too, because one of the first commercials we're going to see is related to getting the kids' spirits up to be an astronaut.
Okay, let's take a look.
Who will be next to launch man in space?
Me!
And so can you with deluxe Man in Space set. The gantry moves in. The space capsule is locked on the mighty Atlas rocket. Blast off! There he goes! Man in space!
It must have been a very exciting time. I mean, to think that you could sort of explore space, the moon.
I wanted to be an astronaut so badly. If you could take a look at this, this was the official Cape Canaveral playset. This was the first ever that came out, because toys back then were still very primitive and didn't work very well until Star Wars came out, and then it became an art form. But you can see there were always little action figures, tiny, didn't have much sculpture to them at all. The vehicles were very cheap. This whole set, there were 150 pieces in the set, and it sold for about $11.95.
Of course, Cape Canaveral, because, of course, President Kennedy was still alive at the time, spearheading the whole NASA project.
This was the capsule I had as a kid to role play with. This was a pencil sharpener. I paid about $1 for it. I had about a dozen of them. That was the only way to recreate playing with, because I couldn't afford the Japanese versions. These were cool. This was about $6. Had great sound effects.
Wow.
colors. Today, this is anywhere from $75 to $250.
Far cry from the first one that we looked at. All of a sudden, we've got lights and we've got movement and motion.
Oh, yeah, this was my other one. This was a copper capsule. This was about $22. I bought this about 22 years ago. This was a bank. And, of course, I had my official Sputnik bank also.
Exciting. This is the time, of course, the U.S. and Russia were really, it was a race to space at the time.
That's what was so exciting. The Cold War had just begun. Kennedy was saying we were going to the moon. It was Russians versus the United States, and the Russians were wiping us out. Because that's why it was so important for John Glenn to go up into space. But one of the cool things is that every kid was Revell model kits had the only really detailed model kit. You had the Atlas rocket, because other household names were the Atlas, the ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the Vanguard, the Redstone rocket. These were all things kids were using for their imagination.
You really get a sense there that it was just a capsule that was just going to be launched
into space. There was nothing detailed, no big computer systems in it, nothing.
Prior to that, the Atlas rocket had actually blown up before John Glenn actually...
One of the first videos, an 8mm film that was out at the time was American in Orbit. The first one that came out for Alan Shepard, the first 2 minutes of it was just rockets exploding. No one even knew if John Glenn was going to be able to survive it or if it would work.
Colonel Glenn's date with destiny comes 10 months after the Russians claimed an orbital flight by Yuri Gagarin, and less than a year after Alan Shepard blazed a suborbital trail for the U.S.
And one of the other commercials that came out, Lionel Trains did a whole series of space commercials. This next one we're going to see is related to Project Mercury and the Atlas rocket.
Okay, let's take a look.
This is a tense moment at the launching base as the huge Atlas missile with the man-carrying Mercury capsule is prepared for the shot. Now, for the first time, this most powerful rocket is to be launched from a railroad car, the new Lionel Mercury capsule launching car. The astronaut is moved to the capsule hatch by the new Lionel cherry picker car. It moves off. The countdown proceeds. 4, 3, 2, 1. And the liftoff. The capsule separates and settles gently to Earth by parachute. And you control the action.
Mike, Mars in Orbit. These were all, they had a lot of novels that came out, all glorifying the Mercury space capsule. And one that I had, Martin Caidin, who wrote Marooned, which later became a really horrible movie. This was a terrific novel. This is the one I carried around with me all the time and read.
Well, you were a man obsessed. You wanted to be an astronaut. What happened?
Oh, my math teacher came up to me one day and said, you know, Ira, you have to be good in math, and you're terrible. So that ended it. So I just wrote to everybody. Oh, yeah, here's my autograph from John Glenn. I sent him Life magazine, which he sent back to me in 1962. But also to be an astronaut, if you wanted to be a cowboy, you had the guns and the hat. Here was the official space helmet. And this was from RCA, where you could plug it into your record player.
Oh, wow.
It came with an accompanying record, and you could play it. The speakers were inside. I used to turn my father's armchair upside down, made believe I was an astronaut, because most of the time the astronauts were always laying on their back, waiting to take off.
So you'd sit there with your helmet plugged into your favorite radio.
And then I'd be playing my 8mm film. I'd be showing it on a projector, make believe I was John Glenn. But one of the coolest things was, to be an astronaut, you had to have the Omega Speedmaster watch.
Oh, sure.
I wanted this so badly. When they got back from the moon, it was the official watch. They had a special one that came out. This was the one I had as a kid for 25 years, totally ran it into the ground. Because it took me forever. This was $395 25 years ago. Now the more advanced version is $2,300.
Wow. So you put a lot of coins into your original copper space capsule.
After I graduated school, I became a member of the Directors Guild, made a living, and was able to afford it. But now John Glenn has the new X33 watch by Omega. This one, normally a chronograph watch has hours, minutes, and seconds. This has days, hours, minutes, and seconds, so you can have the mission time on there. So anytime John Glenn has certain experiments he has to do, this watch will let him know. He could program this as a computer. It'll let him know every time he has an experiment to do. And it's also the Mars series. So if you want to go to Mars, you can plan a year ahead of time with this watch.
Wow.
For daytime on there. And the buttons are all large, so you can use it for Space Glove. And everybody on the Mir space station has this also.
Ira, one of the things that I know, you were saying that you were learning about space as, you know, as the reporters on TV, Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, were learning about it.
Every time Jules Bergman or Huntley and Brinkley or Walter Cronkite talked about some part of the space program, I wrote to everybody. 40% of the people that were portrayed in Tom Hanks' film From Earth to the Moon, I wrote to them all.
So you have a lot of letters, memorabilia. You could check out. You have a website.
I have a website up, televisiontoys.com, putting it all on. But this is my 2-page John Glenn letter. He wrote this for my school newspaper. I graduated too soon, so now I put it on my website now.
Ira, thanks so much for sharing all your John Glenn memorabilia, space memorabilia. I'm going to see if I can be the first reporter in space for World News Now. Absolutely. Stay with us. You're watching World News Now.